Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. I'm at the King Faisal Hall at one of the exhibitions in a groundbreaking conference on Islamic urban heritage. The Saudi government is putting a lot of time, money and effort into promoting its own cultural heritage as well as that in the wider world. In our Heritage Heroes series, we've seen how, at times, urban expansion has done a great deal of damage to our historic sites everywhere. What can be done about this, and why should we care about our cultural heritage anyway? Hello, I'm Zainab Badawi, and welcome to the heart of the Saudi capital, Riyadh, from the King Faisal Hall. And I have here on my panel some of the most distinguished voices in the world of cultural heritage who are going to be sharing with us the challenges that they face. So, who's on our panel? Well, first of all, His Royal Highness Prince Sultan bin Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, and he is President of the Saudi Commission for Tourism and Antiquities. He's played a unique role in stirring the kingdom's interest in saving its built inheritance. Among a great long list of posts and achievements, Prince Sultan, who's a qualified airline pilot, was the first Arab to go into outer space. And Francesco Mandarin is Assistant Director General of UNESCO, the UN's cultural, educational and scientific organization. He's also, for the last 10 years, been director of its World Heritage Center. And Francesco Mandarin is respected throughout the world as one of the most active leaders in the conservation of our inheritance and is a specialist in architecture and urban planning. Amita Baig from India is a heritage management consultant with experience in managing conservation projects and the management of historic sites in India and elsewhere in Asia. And she's also the India consultant for the World Monuments Fund. And Teresa Ancarena from Argentina is a member of the National Committee of Monuments and Historical Places. She's been a member of the legislature in the capital, Buenos Aires, where she was also Secretary of Culture for the city. And Teresa, you were also Ambassador of Cultural Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and you've been involved in more than 100 bills to protect historic sites in Buenos Aires. Quite an achievement, which is what's made you a heritage hero. And finally, but not least, on our panel, Mohammed Ben Isa, a distinguished statesman from Morocco. He was Foreign Minister until 2007, and before that was Minister of Culture. And he also served as the Moroccan ambassador to the United States. So, everybody, that's our panel. Welcome to you all. Now, before we hear from our panel, let's just give you a flavour of the kind of thing we're going to be discussing. And where better else to start than from here, Saudi Arabia, from Rijal Al-Ma'.
The heritage hero of the Saudi Arabian village of Rijal Al-Ma' is Achmed Toshi. In the 1980s, when the old houses were being deserted in favour of new, modern dwellings, he restored one of the traditional 5-storey houses, inspiring the village to do likewise.
The
message we want to give people from this area or from any other country is that we have a heritage. And this area is rich in heritage, with a lot of traditions and a heritage that we are proud of. If we cannot keep our past, then there is no way to keep our present.
The story of Rijal Al-Ma''s preservation is one of the power of individual and community action to save what could so easily have been lost forever.
Rijal Al-Ma' to me was an inspiration by all measures. It is an experience of a people, a group that have believed in culture and heritage, wanted to protect it, saw the benefits of protecting their own heritage. And so it is really an inspirational project for us all.
So, Prince Sultan, an example there, I mean, we saw Achmed Toshi, a real pioneer in this field, and you talking, but I have to ask you, Prince Sultan, why is it only in the last few years that the Saudi authorities have begun to pay attention to the rich cultural heritage in the country?
Well, not just the authorities, but generally the people at large, because we were busy, as we are now also again, with the massive development. And normally development, heritage preservation takes place second to opening streets and high-rises and buildings and so on. So this movement has started for me, at least personally, 25 years ago. I built my own house in mud. And I love living in a mud house.
So you're setting an example.
And I open my own.
A Saudi prince living in a house built of mud.
A lot of these villages
do
come to my house. Hundreds of people
You
have
want
come
to
my
lead
house.
by example.
They come and may I just say, they say, well, if he's living in a mud house, maybe there's nothing wrong with mud houses.
Okay, well, Francesco Mandarin, a Saudi prince living in a mud house, practicing what he preaches. But I want to go back to basics. Why is cultural heritage, our built cultural heritage, important? Why?
I think it's something that we do for ourselves, first of all, for our societies. You know, you have to identify who you are, you know, and every city is a layering of history. You go to Rome or Beijing or Mexico or even London, and you find that the city has not been created in a day. It's been created in hundreds of thousands of years. To recognizing this is very important. It's part of your being. So I think, first of all, there is an important reflection on yourself. But I think also that it is something that we do for purposes. You know, heritage has become throughout the world a very important economic asset. Now, there are lots of people, lots of communities, and it's not just because of tourism that actually thrive on heritage. A community that has preserved its heritage is normally socially stable, attracts investments. It's something that works. Where heritage is disregarded, then social disruption comes along.
The great issue we have is we have a beautiful heritage, but how corresponding to a rich country, to a very rich country, because Argentina was the 8th economy in the world in the beginning of the 20th century. So we have buildings corresponding to New York, to London, to very important cities. But how to maintain those buildings, how to take care of those buildings with the budget of a poor country.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes buildings represent the wrong national identity or identity for a particular people. And I'm thinking here of one very, very extreme example that we've had in recent years was when in Afghanistan, the Taliban who were in power then blew up the old ancient Buddhist structures because they felt it wasn't consistent with who they were today. So sometimes there is this contradiction.
Well, this is a historical fact, actually. It was not the first time that such a thing happened. This is the output of fanatism, extremism, blindness, when people reach a state of rejecting anything else but what they believe in. What has happened in Afghanistan in destroying the Buddhist monument was horrifying. I think the whole world condemned it. And of course, naturally, it has nothing to do with Islam. This is a bunch of people who believe that this is the way they can express their sense of being against something. This has happened in the past in many, many other ways.
Yes.
After the Inquisition in Spain, many buildings were destroyed. In fact, churches were built within the mosque, like what happened in the Mosquita de Cordoba. It happened also in other Muslim countries where mosques were turned into churches, etc. Those are moments in history, and I think we should learn from this. And we should teach our children not to build the future in rejecting the past.
Does anybody else want to comment on this?
Well, I think the interesting thing is we are much more aware of it. What happened 100, 200, or 1,000 years ago are passages of history which we're all aware of.
But it's not just your heritage within your own country, but as global citizens, you have to preserve a few pages, a chapter in the history of mankind.
We have many cases in which heritage falls in or happens to be in areas where the culture has changed. And in fact, with UNESCO, we're trying a lot to make understanding that heritage belongs to everybody. So even if it is not been built by your civilization, it can be incorporated in its own views. The Castle of the Crusaders in Syria are in the World Heritage List. They've been proposed by Syria. So there is a very important change in the approach. We see heritage not as only linked to an ethnic group or to a civilization or to a nation, but also as part of humanity.
Okay, Mohammed Benissa, just very quickly before I go to hear some comments from our audience here, what exactly is cultural heritage, or rather built cultural heritage? How would you define it as a term?
I define it in a very simple expression. It's an inventory of being. As His Royal Highness said, we should not really center around the past per se, but it is the present and the future. And the cultural heritage, in addition to what has been said, a source of pride, a source of identity, a source of knowledge of, etc., roots, it is an inventory which makes people understand who they are and what they can become.
Okay, so we've heard what our panel have said. I'd like to invite comments, perhaps the odd question from our audience here in the King Faisal Hall. The lady here.
At the end of the day, what's happening these times is that people do not understand each other. And I think preserving our heritage, and the challenge is also to try to establish this kind of connection between the youth, our youth, and heritage, because the majority knows nothing about their past. If you do not know your past, you will be unable to explain who you are to others who have these kind of stereotypes about you. And we are really suffering as Muslims from this misunderstanding of what we really are.
Some comments, please.
Nowadays, our main worries, our main preoccupation in the third world is to what extent we can protect our national heritage against alienation of the dominating culture. That is to say that in order to protect our own particular values, our own particular culture, tradition, and habits.
In this first part of our discussion, we have discussed why it's important to preserve cultural heritage for national identity, that kind of thing. But let's look at how you can actually do that. And we have hinted somewhat at the fact that it does actually bring you benefits in the present when you look at the past. And let's look at one particular example now, briefly, from the Indian state of Gujarat.
Karan Grover is an architect practicing in the Indian state of Gujarat. When he's not at work, he's spent the last 30 years campaigning to preserve the architectural remains of the ancient city known as Champaner on the mountain of Pavagad. This mosque dates back to the 13th century. It has many lessons for modern-day architects, says Karan.
The idea of a screen is the most copied in contemporary architecture today. What the screen does is that you have hot air passing through a small opening and expanding. And it is used to passively reduce the ambient temperature.
This is just one of a number of techniques that together can be significant, argues Karan, reducing energy costs for local communities in a sector that is already one of the world's largest energy consumers.
Buildings, incidentally, consume 50% of the world's energy, 50%. More than industry and transport. So, if we can reduce the energy consumption in our buildings by 50%, which we are doing now, this can account for a 25% reduction in energy of the world.
Amita Baig, so looking at India there, one very clear example of how actually looking to the past can hold lessons for the present. I mean, do buildings from the past have to be relevant in some way to people today?
I think there's a lot to be learnt from traditional building technologies. There's a lot to be learnt from the craftsman, which is an ongoing, continuous living heritage we have in it.
Restored all over the world in historic sites, and they're being used today as community centres, internet cafes, so people are actually living in the old buildings.
But if you don't address the issue,
is the Taj Mahal preserved at all costs, but you've alienated its economy, and there just isn't sufficient
center of Riyadh and make it into a culture zone. This is exactly what
so have you come across that, where you have politicians perhaps acting with property developers?
And it depends on criteria, on the level of the ministers of